Well, g'day everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This is Life in the Peloton, and we are Tour de France themed once again this week. This is called the history of the Tour de France. Speaking about history, let's talk about our major partner, Rapha, our partner in the podcast this year. The company started in London in 2004 by Simon Mottram. But the name Rapha, where did that come from? That was taken from the 1960s cycling team Rapha, which was named after the aperitif drink company St. Raphael. This jersey is an iconic, awesome woolen jersey, and that's where it started with Rapha. That's what they were thinking, the culture of cycling, the story. That's what we're about here at Life in the Peloton, and that's what I've got for you this week. Let's talk about this episode, the Tour de France. I've been over here following the race for the last few weeks, and I thought to myself, I don't actually know the full story, the picture. Where did this race come from? How did this race come about? What are the ins and outs of it? How's it evolved over all the years? Well, to give you a quick background on what I'm talking about, the tour started way back in 1903, which makes this year's edition 120 years since the beginning. There's been some breaks along the way due to the world wars, but I thought it'd be really interesting to actually run through the full story of this iconic sporting event that encapsulates the world every July, because it really is a sporting event that just includes everyone. Like I said, I've been in the box seat traveling around with François Thomazeau whilst on this year's Tour de France with the cycling podcast. And I got to ask him about the history of the race. Francois covered 35 editions of the tour as a journalist, and he has a wealth of knowledge and love for the race. As we travelled to each stage during the first week, we sat down and talked about a part of the Tour de France and broke it up into 4 iconic sections. As I speak to you now, I'm at the Charles de Gaulle airport in Paris, flying home from the tour. My Tour de France has come to an end on the second rest day this year. But like I said last week, the thing that has kept me on track this year has been my AG1 travel packs. The AG1 travel packs are portion size, really easy to travel with. I've been using them every day. It's really simple. You rip it off, pour it into your shaker, add some water, shake it up, and away you go. There's no mess, and it's very easy to travel with when you're moving around and living out of a suitcase, just as I've been doing for the last 3 weeks. The best part about AG1 is it's an all-in-one. You don't need a bit of this and a bit of that. No, it's just an all-in-one comprehensive blend of vitamins and minerals, probiotics, superfood complexes, making sure I'm completely topped up of goodness, where when I'm on the road, my diet is a little bit lacking. I was getting out each morning for a run, and when I'd get back, I'd have my AG1 mix, a quick cold shower, and I'd get out feeling like I was ready to tackle the day. AG1 is not just for the elite sports people, even though I used it when I was racing. It's for everyone who wants to feel good and make sure they are covering their nutritional bases. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, AG1 is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/lifeinthepeloton. That's drinkag1.com/lifeinthepeloton. Go and check it out, guys. But now to this episode, I thought I really knew about this race, but actually not a whole lot when it comes to it. And it was really great just to hear the whole story of the race in one place from Francois, especially while the race is on right now. So guys, this is a bit of a long one. I hope you enjoy Francois because he is a really great guest and a great friend and a special guy. Sit back and enjoy. Here is the full history of the Tour de France. All right, as we're traveling, we're over here at the Tour de France, in France, traveling to the stages every day, and I'm lucky enough to be traveling along here with journalist, legend, historian, wealth of knowledge of the Tour de France, François Thomazeau. François, before we get into talking about the whole race, just give everyone a bit of an idea about your background of this race and, you know, why you love the race.
I covered my first Tour de France in 1986, so it's a long time ago now, and I've covered 35. I missed a few. Well, like every Frenchman, I was I was following the Tour as a kid on TV, and it's part of the French culture, Well, I guess like cricket for some of you guys, or whatever you do when you're a Frenchman, you can't avoid the Tour de France. In July, it's everywhere. It's on TV. You switch on TV. You want to watch something else, it's there. So. You kind of bathed in the Tour de France culture from a very young age, which means you know at the age of 7 or 8, you know what a climber, a sprinter is, you know what a breakaway is. I mean, all the vocabulary, the peloton, all those things are part of your culture. Gradually, you become a grown man, and I was lucky enough to start with Reuters, news agency, and in 1986, and they were looking for a sports journalist, and they sent me on the Tour de France out of the blue, and I was kind of I fell in love with the event almost straight away, because when you're a young journalist, and you are a young journalist, Mitch, now, you can't help but be amazed by this moving circus. You go from town to town and people cheer you up. You feel like you're someone. You're in the car waving to guys. Millions of guys. Roadside, and it's kind of exciting, isn't it? and there's all the excitement. There's I was a young journalist at the time, and so the riders were my age, so you had kind of a connection, and then I grew, and I grew older, and I could have been their father, so I had a different relationship with them. Now I could be their granddad, I could be the dad of the DSs. So, but I mean, it's kind of, there's kind of a Tour de France family, and that's kind of a token of how could I say, emotionally involved people are with the Tour de France. Is that there's not a single ex-rider that doesn't, who doesn't try to come back on the Tour de France in some capacity, as a driver, as a consultant, work for a sponsor. I mean, you go to the Village des Pas in the morning, there's about 80 or probably 100 ex-pros doing something there. Yeah, the Tour de France is addictive. It's sometimes, July is kind of synonymous of the Tour de France for a Frenchman. So that's how I got involved in that.
Well, let's start from the very beginning. All right, Francois, no one knows the Tour better than you. Well, no one that I know that knows the Tour de France better than you. But I think this is something that a lot of people don't know, especially I don't know the ins and outs of the history of the race. The race is 110 years old now.
120, actually.
Sorry, 120. Sorry, there we go. He knows the race better than me. Let's go right back to the beginning. 1903, the origins of the race. How did the race even start?
Well, so actually at first there's a dispute between newspapers, right? You had a very, very successful newspaper at the time called Le Vélo, and you must realize that at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, the bicycles were the new all the rage. There was a new thing, it was freedom for the workers. You can go from one place to another without walking. I mean, you cannot imagine what it was. Almost bigger than the internet. So it was something new and really exciting. Freedom. You could go anywhere, and it was a real craze for bicycles. So they created that newspaper called Le Vélo. It was headed by a guy called Pierre Giffard, and this guy was really mad about cycling. He thought cycling would change the world. So this guy invented a number of races, because very quickly cycling become competitive. It was not just a means of transportation. They realized, it would be nice if we, start using this machines for sports, because sport was getting, very trendy at the time as well. So you had, so of course you had track cycling, which was huge in France at the time. But they had this idea that, you could have races on the road. And the big one that Pierre Giffard started was Brest. Brest, as well you can remember, was the start of the Tour de France recently, and the big race was this one. It was taking place like every 10 years. It started 1891.
Oh, it was once every 10 years.
They did 1891. They did one in 1901, and that's around this period, around 1901, that industrials, in the car industry and in the bicycle industry, they decided to create a new newspaper because automobile was coming up and rivaling bicycles as a new means of exciting means of transportation. So they said, let's forget le vélo, bicycles, and let's get into automobiles. So they created this newspaper called L'Auto. There was also a political dispute behind there because the guys who launched the L'Auto newspaper, there was a big scandal at the time with a French Jewish officer called Dreyfus, who was accused of high treason, and it split France in two. Some guys were for Dreyfus, some guys were against Dreyfus. Le Vélo, Giffard supported Dreyfus. Said it's not high treason, it's been accused, unduly. And the guys from L'Auto were against Dreyfus, saying, he's a Jewish traitor and he should be, and he was actually sent, in prison abroad. So there was a political dispute at the start. And so Le Vélo and L'Auto, when they launched their, the new newspaper, they said, well, if we want to really rival Le Vélo, we need to create our own big event on the road,
A reason for people to buy the paper and read.
And also they realized, everyone who worked on a daily knows that during the summer, the sales plummeted. So they needed some excitement in the summer season for readers to keep reading. And so they were looking for ideas. And there was a young guy who was the head of the cycling section in L'Auto called Géo Lefebvre. He was summoned by his boss, which was Henri Desgranges, at a restaurant called Le Zimmer, and not far from the headquarters of the newspaper. And he said, so Géo, do you have an idea?
Was he a bike racer himself?
Henri Desgranges was, yeah.
And Géo?
And Géo Lefebvre was as well, yeah. But Henri Desgranges had been a very good, for the time, cyclist. He was one of the first, holders of the 1 hour record. Yeah. So, and he was also the administrator of the Parc des Princes, which is still a stadium in Paris, and it was actually a cycling track. So yeah, they were cycling fans. They were already sports guys, And so Géo Lefebvre didn't really have an idea, but they had been a race between Paris and Marseille the previous year in 1902.
Paris and Marseille?
Yeah. That's
a fair distance.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, but because at the time, distances were not what they're like. Paris was. It took 2 days to complete. The sort of races you'd like to do now.
No way. It's a bike-packing trip now. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, and so all of a sudden, Géo Lefebvre said, "Well, how about the Tour de France?" And Desgranges said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we could, have a kind of a month-long race going from Paris to the main, big towns in France, around France." And Desgranges at first said, well, no, it will never work, And then he said, "Well, man, it's not such a bad idea." And that's how it started. At that, address. I suppose, when they first started exchanging ideas in that restaurant. It looked a silly idea, but after a couple of, bottles of wine, they probably decided, well, why not? And that's how it started.
Well, tell me about those first couple of editions, because, like you said, they were sort of working out what the race would be, and it was a little bit of, let's say, trial and error, but, these first guys that did it, what did they present on the table? How did they make it attractive for people to come and do? Because it was pretty grand, the idea. The stages were huge. And tell us a little bit about the ins and outs of those first few editions.
There was already competitive cycling. As I said, you had Paris-Brest Paris. You had a race to Marseille. Paris-Roubaix existed. The first what we call the monuments now. A few of them existed before the 1990s. So you already had competitive riders like Maurice Garin, Lucien Lesna. I mean, guys, lots of Belgians, Italians. I mean, the cycling was really the thing. Like, I don't know, like BMX. I mean, it was new and it was for young people. So it was exciting. There was a craving for that. So it was not too difficult for L'Auto to find guys to start the first Tour de France. They were already professionals, So, and there was a bit of money to be made. Actually, the way they did it, because it's also something that's little known, is it was long stages. Because when you wanted to, you went from Paris to Lyon, and then from Lyon to, it was like over 300 Ks almost, every single stage. But there was a rest day in between the stages. It's not like today. But I mean, there's been disputes, in recent years about rest days. Are there too many, too few? At the time, you did the stage and then you had a rest day. So given the length of the stages and the speed at which they rode, you can imagine the sort of bikes they were riding at the time. I don't know, they're probably 12, 13, 14 kilos, bikes. So these guys, they were actually starting the stages at 2 or 3 in the morning. So all the stages were starting, during the night. But ever since the first Tour de France, it was a real popular success. People were, getting up early or, going to bed late to see the guys start and to see the guy ride past. And it was already, it was mythical from the first day. What made it even more popular for the crowds was to support your local guy.
Yeah.
So in the first couple of tours, you had a few instances when the local guy was in trouble, and you had real crowd trouble. The most interesting tour, I guess, is the second one, the 1904. It's the tour where actually everything could have ended there. There were riots. There were,
because wasn't some of the crowd. So they wanted to support their local guys. So the way they supported them, they would sort of make it harder for the competitors, attack them in the night and things like that.
They were putting nails on the road, or they were actually attacking riders.
I heard this.
They did.
Beatings and things like this. These guys were full warriors.
Around in the area of Nîmes, there was a local rider called Payan, and he actually had been suspended the day before, because I mean, they were all cheating. I mean, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have mobile phones. So the riders were they were checks when control points, checkpoints, where the guys were supposed to come and sign. But what they did in between checkpoints, nobody knew. So they went on cars, they went by train at times, all sorts of cheating. And in 1904, everybody cheated. Half the field were, sent at the end of the tour. They were actually suspended from the tour, and the guy who finished fifth finally won the tour. And well, as I said, there was almost gunfighting. It was like
the
Western movies,
yeah.
It was like and it was so rough, and there was so much cheating, and probably a little bit of doping already, that Henri Desgranges at the end of 1904 Tour de France said it's finished. There won't be a third Tour de France, and well, there was, and the rest is history.
Because of all this sort of stuff, one way that I sort of understand is they reinvented it and started doing the stages a bit shorter and doing them during the daytime to help control this. Is that right?
Yeah, they realized after a while that the fact that the stages started in the night, and that they actually could not control what the riders were doing. A best way to keep there under control was to have shorter stages and hold the stages during the day. And that's that's how they did it. I mean, if you take the first 30 years of the tour or 40 years of the tour, they were really trying things and not exactly knowing if it would work or not. In the 1920s, there was a few editions of the tour. There were actually team time trials. It's a system that they tried, to see if it worked. Then, of course, there was also the dispute between should we have national teams in the Tour de France or brand teams like we have today, and it's almost an ongoing debate. Even today, that every so often you've got that suggestion that the tour being the tour to be different from the other grand tours, maybe it would be a good idea to have the national teams in there. So Desgranges was trying things. Time trials were not at first time trials have always been big in Britain, for instance. When there were very few, town to town, in a bunch races, but there was a tradition of time trials. They came rather late in the tour. Same with mountains. The mountains. It took them about 8-10 years to go to the Pyrenees and the Alps, but because they went to the Pyrenees in 1910, in the Alps in 1911. At first they didn't know for sure. I mean, they started to have the first mountain passes, the Col Bayard, in the early editions, and then they went to the Vosges Massif and went up Ballon d'Alsace and Grand Ballon, and gradually the kind of grand scheme of the Tour we see today, like stages in the Pyrenees and in the Alps, regardless of the year. Well, it started in 1910s, and that's when they discovered that actually the mountains added extra excitement. Crowds were found it more interesting, and there was also at first the GC was on points, so what's now the point standings was the overall standings of the time. So they actually really tried lots of different formulas, for the Tour, and up to today, when we're at a time when the Tour that we know today is kind of the results of the lessons of the past, or sometimes not. Like in the 1930s, they stopped the brand. At the time, the brand teams were all bike makers, right? And obviously they were buying, some makes were, buying the best riders, and there was bribery, they were buying races. I mean, and that's when the Grange said, this is bullshit. We're going to change that. And if we have national teams, there will be less money involved, and so will be, it'll be the competition will be fair. Which was not exactly the case, and it's also because there was less money in the Tour de France, because they put the bicycle brands out of it. That's when they invented the publicity caravan as well in the 1930s. They had this idea that
how can we fund this race now? We need to pay for these national teams, their food, their petrol.
So they had this idea to have partners, to have sponsors. So that was very modern. I mean, the Tour kind of invented a number of kind of novelties in the world of sport, like advertising, because the publicity caravan was there before you had adverts in the stadiums or things. So in many ways,
very forward thinking.
Yeah, it was very forward thinking, because it had to be profitable, or at least not lose money. So I mean, from these early years of the Tour, there's lots of legends. I mean, you have pictures with riders with a fag in their mouth, They were all eating together at night, so they were sleeping in schools, They
were fueled by, alcohol a lot of the time.
Yeah, sure. Red wine. There were red wine every day, at dinner. So they were all there, and the press were eating with the riders. So everything was a kind of even more of a big circus, traveling together. A sense of community, and wine was obviously on the menu every night after the stage.
Tell us when the race was starting to get established, more about towards 1920. The first yellow jersey came about. Even just after that, they allowed spare bikes. Now, as you said, it was changing a bit as they were starting to work the formula out. How'd the first yellow jersey come about? What's the origin behind the yellow jersey?
There's actually a dispute there, because it's officially, the yellow jersey was worn for the first time in 1919,
right,
by a guy called Eugène Christophe. It's actually, I looked for and it was not really advertised. They decided that someone in the organization had the idea that the crowds on the road, you must imagine that at the time the roads there were lots of cobbles, with lots of dust. Sometimes the guys were covered in dust, and it was not always obvious for the public to know who was in the lead. Who was?
How did they show the leader before that? An armband or something? They didn't.
No. So they decided that maybe we should have a distinct jersey, so that and one that people can easily spot, and they chose the yellow color because the Lotto newspaper was printed on yellow paper, so it was the same as on the Giro you have a pink jersey, because La Gazzetta dello Sport, which is the newspaper that runs the race, was printed on pink paper. So that was but I actually looked in the archives I went back that year in the archives of in the files of the Lotto, and the announcement of the yellow jersey being created, it was in the middle of the race. it's just like two lines, So it was not like we just invented the yellow jersey. It was just a new little, innovation, but there was nothing really grand. But then later, 20, 30 years later, so there's always the myth of the first yellow jersey. It was disputed that Eugène Christophe was actually the first guy to wear the yellow jersey, because a guy called Philippe Thys was the first man to win 3 Tours de France, claimed that a year before Christophe, he already sported, a yellow jersey, well, for his fans to identify him. So he claimed until his death that he was the first holder of the yellow jersey. So, but officially now, if you ask the official books of ASO, it was Eugène Christophe.
So what was happening behind the scenes now, with the papers? It was successful and it was really bringing a lot of attention. People were really reading it. During the wartime, there were 2 breaks during the First World War and the Second World War, but up until there, this formula they were working out, it was, generally speaking, it was to promote this paper, to keep it running, and it was the race was the race secondary, or was starting to take its own?
To be honest, Lotto was the number one sports newspaper in France at the time, thanks to the Tour de France, and then it became what L'Équipe is today, because L'Équipe is actually Lotto, changed names after the war, but it's the same newspaper. But Le Tour, as you say, took a life of its own and became, probably bigger than the newspaper that created it. I mean, the success and the popularity of it was huge. In the summer, when kids were not going to school any longer, for all the kids, for a generation of French kids, the summer was the time when, the sun is back, school is out, and the Tour is back. And the legend of the Tour was even more, I think, even stronger for the kids, as they couldn't see it. If you see what I mean, no TV, so it was all, they were following the race on the radio. So there were radio coverage of it. They were reading the papers. I mean, some newspapers at the time, not only Lotto, because the Tour became so popular that all the other newspapers started covering it. And there were some magazines like Miroir du Cyclisme that during the Tour would publish 2 editions, one in the morning, one in the evening, for people, lots of pictures. And so the idea that the kids of the Tour de France was the kind of black and white, photographs from the champions, and then listening to the Tour finish on the radio. And they were often, so not everybody at the radio. So they're all flocking around the radio receiver, sometimes in bike shops, and you always had a guy in a village with a blackboard, with the name of the riders and what they were doing. So it was excitement. And it was, as I said, probably even more powerful that it was like imagination. And from time to time, the Tour came to you, came to your town, and that was for kids. It was magic. All of a sudden, these guys you'd seen pictures of were coming to your town, and you could almost touch them, because as you know, what makes cycling different from many other sports is that not only are the guys in your town, but you can talk to them. You can, especially at the time, they were in the morning. There was no press village. The bunch were coming, the riders were coming, they were having coffee and a fag in the local cafes. So you could really talk to them, you could touch them, they can sign, pictures and stuff, and it was huge. And my father, is now 101. So his idol was Georges Speicher, who's the guy who won the Tour in 1936, I think. And so he had a chance to one day, during that summer, he was 14 at the time. He had a chance to see, Georges Speicher
in person.
Yeah, in person, and for them it was, just magic. So really, that tradition of Le Tour as a magic moment of childhood and a magic moment of summer, dates back to a century ago.
Well, I wanted to talk about that first bit right up until 1939, where there was a significant break for the Second World War. And when we come back, we can talk about this next phase where I think the race really took a different sort of shape, and we started to see the development through that next period. All right, Francois, this is part 2 where I think, the tour had a nice spell from 1939 to 47 during the Second World War. But when it came back in 1947, the race returned. But this time, Omeray and Godet, they owned half the race itself each. Tell me about now. What was the race looking like now when it came back, and it took a new sort of direction in a way?
Well, first of all, it was split between Amaury and Godet for the simple reason is that the government wanted the tour to come back because it was a sign of return to normality. The tour was the symbol of fun, childhood, long summers, and for the tour to be back was proof that life was returning to normal. Like the tour was already stopped by the First World War and then resumed. So it was really a token of life is becoming the same as in the past again. But it was split between Godet and Emilien Amaury because Amaury was in the resistance against the Germans. He had been part of the clandestine fighting against the occupiers, and Godet, as I said before, was at a kind of a dodgy. He never totally resisted. He never was in favor of the Germans in any way, but his situation at the end of the war was complicated. His newspaper Lotto had to change names because it kept being published during the war and during the German rule. So he had to change the name of the newspaper, and when he decided that the government said, "Okay, go ahead." When General de Gaulle at the time was pressed for the tour to go ahead, you couldn't have Godet, given his mixed attitude during the war, as the sole owner and manager and director of the tour. And also, so Lotto became L'Équipe, and which is still the case, and. Emilien Amaury was the owner of a new newspaper called Le Parisien Libéré, the Liberated Parisian, which proves, he was a newspaper that lots of newspapers after the war had the word liberated, because all newspapers who collaborated during the war were taken over by new teams, and to emphasize the fact that they were not linked to the Germans in any way, they added, so you had the Dauphiné Libéré, you had the Parisien Libéré, you had the Midi Libre, so it was all linked to the war, So the tour resumed 1947, and it was a bit, so until probably 1952, when Copy appeared in the picture, it was kind of the mixture, the tour of the past and the future, because if you take the guys who were prominent in 1947 tours and 1948, the big guys were riders who had been good riders before the war. Like 1948, Gino Bartali won the tour. He already won the tour in 1938, 10 years earlier. Without the war, it's everybody thinks that Bartali was so strong, so good, he would probably have won God knows how many, but more than 2 tours, because he was at the end of his career in 1948 when he won his second tour. You had guys like Jean Robic, who won the 1947 tour, who had been in cycling for a long time. You had guys like René Vietto, who was a legend, and at the time France's favorite rider, who had already been a star in the 1930s. So you had a mixture of both. But the pre-war generation was kind of wiped out at the beginning of the 1950s. Then 50, 51, you had Swiss Koblet and Kubler, one after the other, and Koblet, the Pédaleur de Charme was a new generation of riders, more elegant, more, maybe the background was a little bit different as well. You started to have riders coming, but maybe a little bit less from the rural country France, and so things were changing fast. I think the main change, the guy who brought something really new to cycling at the time was Fausto Coppi, definitely. Because the way he prepared for racing, he had doctors with him, he had, the training, the food, the diet, everything was taken into account. We're getting into modern cycling, whereas before the war, as we mentioned, of course the guys were training, of course there was training scheme and plans, but it was still, not very professional or scientific, they were, and really Coppi brought something new in terms of all the sort of training we you still know to the day. In the winter, doing fractional things. I mean, all those methods came into force in the 1950s, not only in cycling, in other sports as well. And Coppi was really the guy who introduced the new methods, and also which is as which will be decisive for cycling in the years to come. I mean, doctors came into cycling for the good of it and the bad of it, from the bright side of it and the dark side of it, and there was a major change.
What about François Coppi? Like, I know you spoke about the professionalism there, but also off the bike, he was a bit of a superstar as well. People liked to flock towards him. He was a good-looking guy. He presented himself really well, and they say from the stuff that I was reading, he was giving almost like a gold dust to these newspaper articles because he was great to write about. He's a great sportsman on the bike, but he was the full package. Do you think that was something that in those days they were thinking about? Because you see it later on with Jacques Anquetil. He was also in a similar vein. Was that part of the sport then?
Yeah, well, it was true in the past as well. I mean, in the 30s, guys like Le Duc or Antonin Main were also rather good-looking guys with kind of star material, but Coppi was different. I mean, he was good looking, but he had a strange face, very long nose, and also I think the main thing, and that's what you need in sport, it was the big rivalry with Bartali. The Coppi Bartali, rivalry is one of the great rivalries in the history of cycling, and that's what you need. Same nation, the older guy, the younger guy. Bartali was, very religious person who was actually a hero during the war. He used his bike, to bring stuff to the Italian resistance. He saved Jews as well. So, there were all the ingredients of what the media was there. What changed as well with Coppi is that if you take the big GC riders, first and foremost, they're time trial specialists. Amazing time trialists. It's true for Anquetil, it's true for Merckx, it's true for Hinault, it's true for
Were they time trial specialists or were they just strong?
Well, they were time trial specialists because Coppi was on the track very often.
Yeah, okay.
He went after the tour in the August-September season. They were all often going on the track, trying to tackle the world hour record. So they really had a tradition. These guys and Coppi was really a strong, very strong track rider, which was not the case for Bartali, for instance. So, and also the time trials were introduced in the Tour de France gradually, and there were far fewer in the pre-war system. Then gradually there would be more and more, and that they would take more and more importance in that. What emerged, as you say, there were strong riders, but what Grand Tours suddenly showed was that if you're an exceptional time trial specialist, most of the time, if you lose weight, if you take the right diet, then you become a great climber, because you're not going to lose that much time in the mountains. So yeah, that's when things started to change, I think. And with Coppi, and then the generation that would follow, Louison Bobet, and these guys, even Coblet, which I mentioned already. These guys were really a new generation of far more elegant riders, better trained. And probably, as I said as well, with doctors and soigneurs around them, maybe some of the stuff the attitude towards doping in the mid-50s. You started having stories in the newspapers in the mid-50s about doping, so there was already an awareness that something,
it wasn't frowned upon, was it? It was more just
they were asking themselves questions. You had articles in the media asking, is that good? That you had doctors, is that good if guys take pills and tablets to improve that? And so at the time, the saying was that, but that's for their own good, it's for their own health. But the debate already existed at the time. But it became more and more. At least there were already doctors and soigneurs and doping before the war. But it was there's a famous story in 1923 when the Pélissier brothers pulled out of the tour and said they were taking cocaine. But gradually, the importance of doctors and pills and tablets was more obvious. It had to wait for the mid-60s for the peloton and the media and the public to realize, probably after Tom Simpson's death at the Ventoux in 1967, that doping might be a problem. So the evolution of the tour followed the evolution of society, because we for one thing, amphetamines, which were predominant probably in those days, they were invented during the war by the German army, and at the same time, Germany won the football World Cup, and also probably it was for them a way to be back on the international scene. Kind of a post-war thing was the amphetamines, the corticoids, all this stuff had been discovered for the army during the war, and all of a sudden those products were used, and the tour evolved. I mean, I mentioned doping because it's and doctors because it's Coppi was the first guy to do that, and fortunately for him, he died young after catching a disease. They were doing kind of promotional tours in Africa, and several riders went there. Raphael, Geminiani, Coppi, and then he caught a virus and died. But so the myth, the Coppi myth, also comes from the fact that he also had a complicated love life, let's say, and so the People magazines of the time,
they loved it.
Yeah, they were all about what's Coppi's love life like, Anquetil as well. So we'll go to Anquetil next, but Anquetil also turned out as a very, very strange love life. I mean, they had at least 2 wives, as far as we know. I mean, it's So these guys were kind of all of a sudden kind of on top of being top athletes. They were kind of larger than life. They had something different, and also gradually the media technology evolved, and the radio was all over the place, and more cameras were coming into the race. And in the late 50s, you started to have the first kind of TV reports. I mean, television was almost nothing in France. There were a couple of guys in Paris at the TV set, but gradually television came into the picture and was going to change the scene totally.
Well, exactly what you said. It was really changing because, like in 1954, they had the first Grand Depart outside of France, up in Amsterdam. So the race was becoming more international. I know it was already international, but for the viewers, they wanted to push the race. Why did you think they decided to take the race up, outside of France? Was there the demand to get it a bit more into was it money? Was it, to expose the race?
I mean, there was lots of money in it already. I think Amaury had money, and the Tour de France legend was spreading, and in continental Europe, at least, cycling was still a big sport, one of the most popular ones. Obviously, going to Amsterdam was kind of obvious because, I mean, it's, as you know, a cycling mad country. I mean, probably bikes are the main means of transportation. Yeah. I think there are more bikes than people in the Netherlands. But I'm only half joking, So yeah, it was not the first foreign town to have the Tour, because there had been stages, across to Switzerland, or even in the early days of the Tour, they were going to Metz, which is now in France, but at the time was in Germany. So I mean, there was obviously an intention, and the fact as well that after Robic and before Bobet came in, you had Swiss winners, you had, Coppi won it as well. So it was more and more international, and the Tour needed that. You could tell from the start. The French journalists, sports journalists at the time, they felt they had kind of a universal mission to spread the sport, and they invented all these sports events. As we say, the Tour de France was invented by journalists. The soccer World Cup was invented by French journalists. The European, what we call now the Champions League football, was also invented by journalists from L'Equipe. So there was this craving for international confrontation in sports, and so the Tour de France, being such a big event in the mind of the journalists from L'Equipe, and had to spread and conquer other lands, and which it did gradually until today. I mean, we started from the Basque Country. I mean, like now every other year we start from abroad, So the tendency. I've seen lots of. If you go on YouTube, you'll see that there's a great film about this 1954 Tour de France starting in the Netherlands. It's in Dutch, and it's really I mean, every stage is it's black and white, but it's nice. It's really cool to watch. So you could tell it really did a lot of good also to cycling in the Netherlands. They're starting to have stars like Wim van Aert, the first Dutchman to hold the yellow jersey, and so by spreading in a way the Tour de France was spreading the cycling word around, and this first, as you said, the symbol, the first Grand Départ outside of France, showed our all of a sudden cycling, which was like Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, became all of a sudden far more European, and then would gradually conquer other lands.
Well, there's this continual debate as well in this whole period. As you mentioned, the World Cup, the Olympics, these were national team events, if you want to call it that. And, the Tour de France was considered by Godet as on that level. And he was continually pushing for the national team participation. But it was a back and forth period. And over that period, I think it came to a boiling point where they went, we can't continually to fund this. This is costing us too much money. Let's get some sponsors back in. Or how did that all happen?
Yeah, well, obviously, when you mentioned Godet, Godet was a journalist, okay, he was in a way also a businessman, because the newspaper and the races had belonged to his father and to his family. But when Amaury came, Amaury was above all a businessman. He was there for the money. I mean, okay, he loved the sport, and it was great to have the Tour de France, but he was more a media guy, a kind of a press tycoon, and he needed to sell newspapers, but it also, he couldn't afford a Tour de France that was losing money. So how do you get more money? So as we said, in the 1930s, the publicity caravan appeared. The publicity caravan remained and was more and more present, and and the sponsors, and to be a partner of the tour was more and more costly. But as you say, national teams, who would pay for it? The governments wouldn't pay for it. The sports federation might give a little bit of money, but not much. So the catering, the lodgings, everything was paid by tour hotels. Everything was paid by the tour organization. So they said, and also that was not the evolution of cycling everywhere else. On other races, guys were riding for their team, which was a brand team. So it couldn't last for long. It was really clashing with both Amaury's ambitions and the way cycling was organized. These guys for the rest of the season were racing for I don't know, Mercier or Peugeot, and why would they race for the national teams on the Tour de France? It was kind of strange. So gradually Godet, Amaury took more, and the Amaury family and all the guys around, because Godet gradually with age, left other guys in charge of the tour. And I'm thinking, for instance, Félix Lévitan became tour director around that period. Félix Lévitan was a journalist from Le Parisien. It was the first time he was not from L'Équipe. He was from the other newspaper, so very close to the Amaury family. And Lévitan, he was a very good businessman. He had started, before being a journalist, he had sold TV sets and stuff. So he was very cunning in how to make money. It was obviously at the end of the 60s that the national teams could not go on, and so they for the first time since the 1930s they went back to brand teams, and it's stayed like this ever since.
Look, this period here was the arrival of Jacques Anquetil, the first 5-time winner of the Tour de France, and it was starting to take a different sort of shape, as you said, with the trade teams being involved. Even though it did go back to the national teams for a couple of years later in the 60s, during that period there was trade teams. The shape of the race at that point, I have the feeling, and obviously not knowing them, but it was taking a different shape. It was becoming this race that we more know today.
Yeah, because also, Jacques Anquetil, you mentioned him, was, in the same mold in a way, as I said, as Coppi, very strong time trialist, and very, at first he was not a born climber, but he grew. Actually, won his first one, and it took him a few years to win a second one. Very, very gifted, same kind of rather, elegant, and also, there was a huge rivalry, national rivalry with Raymond Poulidor, who is, Mathieu Van der Poel's grandfather, and the rivalry between Poulidor and Anquetil made the headlines in France for decades, because, you had the gifted guy, the guy who was winning everything, who was kind of the elegant, a little bit aloof guy, and on the other side you had Raymond Poulidor, the guy from the country, fighting hard and never quite making it. I mean, Poulidor,
perfect story.
Yeah, and Poulidor was so popular. Poo-Poo, he was all over the place. Everybody loved him, and he's a guy who finished on the podium, almost every time he entered the Tour. Not always, but I mean, he was, but he came second and third several times, and so he never held the yellow jersey once.
Wow.
In his 14 Tour de France. So it was. Yeah, so the rivalry was something else. But as you say, what changed as well was the reason. Another reason why they scrapped the national teams is because you had so many French riders for one thing. So you had to have France A, France B, and then you had to have the Southwest region and blah blah blah. And there were internal rivalries, and obviously didn't suit the organizers or the teams to have this kind of how the selections were made and everything. It was really dodgy. And also what changed is that the format of the stages, they got shorter. Then, as I said, pre-war, it was very common to have 300, 400 case stages at times. So, these were streamed down to what we know now, around 200, 250, which was already...
They were even trialling some split stages as well, weren't they?
There were started to have lots of split stages. One of the reasons why I think Félix Lévitan was one of the fans of the split stages, but because if you have split stage, you have a start on one stage, finish in the split stage in another town, and then you start from another town, and so we got 4 towns paying.
Perfect.
So that was one of the reasons why they were doing it. And so you had more time trials. Some of the big climbs that were going to become legends of the Tour, the Ventoux and l'Alpe d'Huez. They went to l'Alpe d'Huez for the first time in 1952. Fausto Coppi won up l'Alpe d'Huez, and they found it too hard. And Coppi was so dominant in l'Alpe d'Huez. They said, no, it's not a good climb. Only the best, the very best will win up there. So for a while they said no, we won't come back. But that's the period when all these big mountains that become Izoard, for instance. You had big fights between Coppi, Bobet, and these guys. So the legends of the mythical, Tourmalet, Galibier started 1910. I mean, the 1910s, they were the first huge mountains that the Peloton was tackling. But these other climbs like Alpe d'Huez, Ventoux, Izoard,
took a while.
They really become really famous in the 50s and 60s. And for le Ventoux, even if it was used several times before, unfortunately, I should say, Tom Simpson's death on the Ventoux in 1967, made a lot for the legend of the race. It's an important moment, the Tom Simpson death in 1967. We have to talk about it a little, because then, only 2 years later, a phenomenal rider would, arrive on the scene, Eddie Merckx. Simpson's death was also the end of an era, because all of a sudden the Tour, which was all about fun, joy, happiness, childhood, there was drama, tragedy there. There had been others, but this time was on television, which made a big difference. And all of a sudden there was a conscience that, things had to be changed. Was the Tour too hard? Was doping a bad thing? Should they have rest days? As I said, before the war, they had rest days in between stages. They had almost one stage, one rest day. But that had gone, in the 50s and 60s. They were racing every day. So, the Tour was taking the shape that is gradually came to what we come to know now, with time trials, team time trials, mountain stages, sprint stages. I mean, all those little ingredients that make the Tour now started to take shape and once and for all in the 50s and 60s.
Well, Francois, it's time for part 3, the golden era, racing with the legends almost, isn't it?
Yeah, because we had legends already in Fausto Coppi, and we mentioned Jacques Anquetil. But in 1969, the summer of 1969, which was a good time for probably rock and roll and other trends, but it was also the emergence of the cycling legend, and arguably one of the greatest sports persons of all time. That is Eddie Merckx. Eddie Merckx won the first Tour de France he entered in 1969. Didn't win the first stage, but won the immediately after the second and swept the board, won everything. That first tour he entered, stages, all the jerseys available. I mean, a little bit like Tadej Pogačar today, but he was the first guy to, sweep that many rewards. Hence his nickname that came pretty early in his career of the Cannibal,
The Cannibal, what a name.
The guy who couldn't stop, eating up, swallowing all the competitions he entered. And there was the beginning of an era that would last not that long. He didn't have such a long career compared to some others. Only did the 7 Tour de France, but won 5.
The second rider to win 5 at that point.
Yeah, the second rider to win 5 at that point. The question mark is always there because I mean, he on the 7 he did. There's also 1 year he took a year off after having a saddle problem at the Giro. Had he ridden more? He might have started a little bit earlier to do the tour and might have finished a little bit later. There's 1 year he took off. Was it a good idea? I mean, anyways, won 5, and the most striking thing about Merckx was still the joint, as we speak, record winner of stages as well in the Tour de France with Mark Cavendish. I mean, it's easy when you have cycling quizzes, dear listeners, and there's a question about records. I mean, 90% of the time, the answer is Eddy Merckx because, most, he won all the classics. He won the 3 Grand Tours. I mean, I think almost every race in the calendar he won. I think the only one missing was the Olympics because at his time, he did the Olympics actually at the time when he was amateur. But he didn't win those, and at the time the pros were not allowed in the Olympics. So that's the only big void in his record. I think apart from that, that's the thing. It is far quicker to try and find out what he didn't win than to mention everything he won.
What was happening with the actual race at this point, and just from imagery myself looking at it, this was when it started to really, the bikes were really appearing on the top of the cars. The teams, were looking like the more what we're used to seeing today. I'm not saying before that with Anquetil, as we spoke about, that was starting to happen in those years. But Eddy Merckx, from what I understand, he was waiting for the national team stuff to finish so he could ride with his trade team there. Mm-hmm. The bike sponsors. What was happening with the race at this point? What was the shape?
It changed dramatically. Return of the of the trade teams. TV was starting to be all over the place. When it only started, TV was started to be prominent in the early and mid 60s, and then the tour became really a television show, which was not the case before. So even more than in the past, these guys were household names, and just because you saw their faces every day in July on your TV screen. So obviously a real change of period, and it's a very important one. The television aspect, not only for the Tour de France, but for most sports at the time. It was starting even the Olympics that were not on TV, started being on TV. It changed the whole game because more exposure means more sponsors, means more publicity, more everything. So, I mean, and if you look at the evolution of the Tour de France and ASO, it was created by journalists from the written press. Gradually they turned to, and now the head of the Tour de France, Christian Prudhomme, is a TV guy. So I mean, the shift from the written press to the TV, I mean, the evolution of the media was also striking in the evolution of the Tour de France, because TV had more and more power and more presence on the tour, and it changed the way. Look, nowadays I was mentioned in the first part that kids at the time, only had the radio and the newspaper to kind of imagine what the race was like. Now you have live coverage from start to finish on various channels. So the perception of the race has changed a lot. Also the race itself, because it's becoming impossible to cheat or to relax or to. There are lots of things you could do on the race in the past that you can't anymore because you scrutinize. There's always a website who's going to write a story about it. So that started in that era. with the television becoming more and more prominent in there. I mentioned doping in the previous part. You started to have around 1966 and 1968 the first doping tests. So I mean, this also changed. So there were strikes. Riders were not happy with it. So I mean, all the ingredients that would define the cycling in the coming years, trade teams back in there, so sponsors, money, TV, attracting more visibility, more sponsors, more partners, more money, and doping, which would, so in the beginning it was in a way, good for the show because better performances, better feats, the race went harder and faster. But I mean, there is. I mentioned a moment that we must come back to. It's only 2 years before Maersk won his first Tour de France. As we said, Tom Simpson died on Le Ventoux, and there was a kind of an awareness that in terms of medical assistance products, it was getting too far. But that's where we were at the time. Doping was becoming a problem. For the first time in the past, who cared,
Yeah.
TV was there, and trades and brands were back in the sport. So obviously, as you can imagine, it changed everything.
It sounds like now, the race, with the trade teams back in, the race wasn't having to pay for a lot of extra things that they were covering with the national teams, but not too long after that, there was the creation of the infamous polka dot jersey that we see now, and this... I was wondering how this jersey came about, but it was actually about sponsorship money, to bring a little bit more money into the race. They needed a new idea to keep funding of the race, and at this time, you sort of don't, as a rider, you sort of don't imagine why these ideas come about, but at the end of the day, it's to get a bit more sponsorship money back into it.
Yeah, and at the same time, to also add interest to the race, because I mean, at the time, you often had long, flat stages for sprinters that might be. There were less of a problem at the time because you didn't have, as I said, long live coverage. So it was on TV like the last, only like the last half hour maybe, and sometimes not even live, like shortly after the stage, so you could afford to have long, boring stages in the morning. I mean, it didn't change a thing in terms of the publicity caravan and the race, riding past spectators on the road. But then also there was probably the acknowledgement that to have just stage winners and the yellow jersey was not enough. That if you added other competitions inside the competition, it made it more exciting. So the points classification had already existed, but it created the points jersey before, the green jersey, and then they thought, we have more and more climbers, and pure climbers winning the race. And it started with Federico Bahamontes in 1959, and in that era, at the end of that era, Lucien Van Impe would win. Pure climber would also win so climbing and climbers had more and more were more and more important in the race, and there were a different breed, and they didn't get sometimes the recognition they deserved. I mean, there was also a mountain classification, but you need something to, like with the yellow jersey, to recognize them, and so it was important to get there. And as you said, they were looking for more sponsors, and sponsors sponsoring the jerseys was a great way to do it. And so there was a brand of chocolates called Chocolat Poulain, and they actually had when I remember as a kid, when you opened a packet of Chocolat Poulain, there was a kind of film inside of the main package with dots, and so
red dots.
Yeah, red dots on. It was not actually white. The film, it was like silvery. Yeah, it's one also that there are various versions of the story, but normally that's so it was kind of a trademark of the Chocolat Poulain, these dots, and so they decided to create the polka dot jersey, which was a brilliant idea. Even today, it's kind of even more showy and even more distinctive, as they say, than the yellow jersey in a way. So yeah, it started there.
Tell me about when now, just after this, it decided to come, not decided, the race went up and finished for the first time on the Champs-Élysées. Very, very iconic to the race now. It's a procession now, and it's really the closing of the race. Tell me about why they decided to come up there and this idea, how that all came about.
Yeah, so they were up till 1975, which is when they went on the Champs-Élysées for the first time. But the race was finishing on cycling tracks, mainly at Parc des Princes. There was another place, another stadium, east of Paris called La Cipale. That means the municipal. It was a municipal stadium, so it was called La Cipale. And La Cipale was becoming, obsolete, so you couldn't use it. The Parc des Princes, they couldn't use either because they were rebuilding it, and it was rebuilt to become a football stadium. It is still a football stadium. It's still the home of Paris Saint-Germain today. So it was getting tricky to find the right, they didn't have the right track for that. And it's actually a TV journalist called Yves Mourouzi. He was like, the 1 o'clock news anchorman for the first channel in France, TF1. A very popular figure at the time. And he had that idea, he had a lot of influence. And one day he told the then President of the French Republic, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, it would be a good idea if we could go to the Tour de France on the Champs-Élysées.
Because they only shut the Champs-Élysées down one day a year, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely for the Bastille Day. So Bastille Day celebrations were huge, and actually Mourouzi was the guy who was commenting the marching and the army and all the stuff during the Bastille Day, and that's when the idea came up. He said, well, why don't we have the finish of the Tour de France on the Champs-Élysées, a little bit like we have the celebration of Bastille Day, and the French president said, it's not a bad idea. I'll talk to the guys at the Tour de France, and they thought it was a good idea as well. And if the French president said we can do it, so they said, well, let's do it, and that's how it started, and it's still there.
A couple of years later, sort of like around 1977, that was when Emilien Omeray he dies, he passes away, and then now the race then is presented for his kids, really. It's like, okay, well, this has been the guy who's sort of harnessed this race as well as and now he's passed away. The new sort of evolution of part of, it's also got to do with the riders, but it's also got to do with who's running the race, with the vision of where it happens. And for a long time, it was Emilien. After his passing, and it was passed on to his son, Philippe, and that was a bit of a battle. I don't know, do you know much about that whole situation?
Yeah, the thing is, Philippe Amaury, so the son of Emilien, he was more, his father was as well, but he was more of a newspaper guy. He was more into, he was less involved, I guess, into the cycling part of his empire than his father might have been, and there was social unrest at the time in Le Parisien because of, as often in the media, the technology was evolving. There were more and more color in the newspapers, the way things were printing. The first computers were coming, and so all a generation of printing workers were becoming redundant. So there was a very strong and very hard strike in the late 70s at Le Parisien. It lasted for months. The newspaper was not published for a month, but Philippe Amaury didn't kneel. He said, that's the way it is. That's the evolution. And so he kind of won the social battle with the unions at the time, but this created a kind of a drift between l'équipe, the Parisien, who used to work together, and le Tour de France, and they were still in the mix, but they became really separate entities, and they had working less together in a way, and so. For until this time was called La Société du Tour de France, and the status gradually evolved through, for the La Société du Tour de France to evolve into what we know today as Amaury Sport Organization. So it was. I think the fact that, and so Philippe Amaury didn't knew the Tour de France was important, but he really.
His focus wasn't there.
Yeah, focus wasn't there. So he gave it to other people to take care of. Godet was still there until mostly until his death. But in the same time, Philippe Amaury named real managers who were not journalists, who were not into sport, to try and develop the brand Le Tour and to try to make it something different, more profitable, and gradually we saw the publicity caravan evolve. it's also the time when TV rights appeared. There was no TV rights before the 1970s. I mean, you didn't let the TVs didn't have to pay to. It was almost the other way around.
You pay the TV.
Yeah, sports pay the TVs for them to come, and it started to change during this period. So Philippe Amaury was one of the actors, who led or followed this trend, and so it changed the tour totally.
It was at a pretty nice time too, because at that time, was the emergence of the Badger. Great nicknames at this time. Bernard Hinault, who went on to win 5 Tour de France's as well. The French legend. Tell me a bit about this era as well, because this is a really important part for the Tour de France, for France, but also the development. This is sort of really leads into this modern era that we know today.
So Merckx kind of, a champion like Merckx is kind of is in a way very good for sport, and in a way not very good, because when you got a guy who's so dominant, it makes the competition a little bit less interesting. So, well, of course, Merckx had rivals like Joop Zoetemelk and Luis Ocaña, who finally won tour, the tour that Merckx missed. But for the French public, and it's very important, the French public, for the Tour de France, after the end of the Anquetil and Poulidor era, there were no more heroes. So they badly needed another outstanding French rider. And Bernard Hinault came into the forefront. It's actually in Hinault's period. You have to name a guy that's Cyril Guimard. Cyril Guimard was his team manager, and he'd already won the Tour in '76 with Lucien Van Impe. I mentioned Lucien Van Impe, who was actually the first holder of the polka jersey. And Guimard was a former rider, rather successful. He competed for GC in the Tour, but he was more a sprinter. And yeah, that's true. He was a sprinter, but there was a couple of years when he also,
was up there in the GC.
Yeah. And he was really innovative in a way. He came with new ideas. So we mentioned copy, and Guimard he was the first, to have tests in labs, all sorts of aerodynamics. I mean, he introduced, lots of technical evolutions. He was a lot into that stuff. And so the meeting between Guimard and Hinault was the magic formula. Hinault started as a runner. He was not,
really.
Yeah, in his youth, he was more long distance runner in Brittany, and but like lots of Bretons with the tradition of Jean Robic, Louison Bobet. You can't avoid riding a bike when you're in Brittany. So it's one day, friends told him, come with us, on the cycling race. Took a bike, and went for it, and
killed everyone.
Killed everyone. It's a story that's quite common with champions, but it's actually what happened. And from then on, I mean, his evolution and progress was stratospheric, and he rode the Tour, won it, 78, and then he was almost like Merckx. He's one of the guys who nearly won everything. He was He was called the Badger because of his face. He had this kind of kind of lean, and he was also fast. Badgers are not very are kind of rough animals, and the Badger was not a nice guy. In the race, he was like the real boss of the peloton. It's funny because I've met and talked to Hinault many times. I'm not going to say we're friends, but I know him rather well. And there was a time when I was working for ASO's website, that I was asked to go after the stage, especially in Paris-Nice, and ask the Badger about what he thought of the next stage was going to be. And so but he was absolutely dreadful as an analyst of cycling, because the tactics he would use didn't apply to normal riders. So he would simply say, if I was whoever, Roglic, Pogačar, well, I would attack from the gun and win the stage. You could do that, but maybe cycling has changed a little bit. So he was a little bit like Merckx, a kind of phenomenon. And you can't really compare him to anybody, like all these champions, to anybody else. He could unbelievable time trialist. He was he didn't lose lots of time in the mountains. Sometimes he was steady and bullfighter, in the climbs, never giving up. And probably his best wins, actually, his most spectacular wins were in the classics. He won probably the best, the most grueling edition of Liège-Bastogne-Liège in the snow. Almost everybody else gave up. He was freezing cold, and it was, that's typical,
Did this character, what did it do to the Tour de France, but also, like you said, the French needed someone like this. I think this is what really almost injected this beautiful sort of storyline energy into the race.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the thing is, as I said before, you need a rivalry, and the rivalry came pretty quickly and within his own ranks. At the end of his career, had to face two guys who were in his own team. One was Laurent Fignon, who won 2 Tours de France in 83, 84, being in the same team as the Badger for the first year. And then Cyril Guimard was kind of a visionary, had pioneering views. He could feel that cycling was becoming more international. You started to have Irish riders coming in. You started to have and Americans and Russians and all sorts of. And Guimard, with an eye for the good riders, spotted this young American called Greg LeMond. He made sure he came to France, because at the time that's the way he went. You were Australian like Phil Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
You were Irish, you were British, you would come to France, race with ACBB, which was a club near Paris, La CB, Boulogne-Billancourt, and so all these guys, were really coveted by the European managers, and Guimard spotted these guys. So all of a sudden, found himself with a younger generation coming up, and also that's the moment when. So actually, he won his last tour in 1985, and it's still to the day the last French win in the Tour de France. And what happened actually is that, in a way, Guimard kind of dug the grave of French cycling by bringing in new blood from abroad. And I think the next step, Greg LeMond is probably the man who took the Tour de France to another dimension, which is global interest.
All right, Francois, part 4, pretty much from 1988 right up until today. I've sort of nicknamed it the doping era, and I guess whether that's right or wrong, some of this period has got a bit of a black cloud over it because of the doping that was going on. And interestingly enough, to start this discussion off is when LeBlanc sort of came in charge, the new race director. Tell me a bit about how all that came about.
Well, it's actually directly the result of a doping scandal. 1988, Pedro Delgado won the Tour de France, and he was found out that he had used a banned product, but the thing was, the product was on the was a kind of a steroid. The product was actually on the IOC list of banned products, but it was not on the UCI list of the banned products. So it was finally cleared, because the substance was not actually forbidden by the UCI, who was running the Tour de France. So Delgado won the Tour, but there was already kind of a shadow of a mark, on his victory. And the way the organizers handled the scandal was seen as not very professional. And Jean-Marie Leblanc was the head of the cycling department of L'Équipe, the newspaper, and he wrote very, very strong columns against the organizers after this doping scandal, despite the fact that, as we've said, they belong to the same Amaury group. But he was very, very outspoken about how the whole Delgado scandal was handled. Well, they sacked the directors of the time, who would only be there for 1 year actually, because they'd replaced Félix Lévitan, who was who was there for more than 20 years, and Leblanc, because of the stand he had taken against these guys and against doping, was named the new director of the Tour de France.
At this time, it was becoming a little bit more open to the world, from what I understand. with Greg LeMond there, the US sort of audience became more involved. Obviously, in that time, we had that, still probably the best Tour de France finish, with that closest victory from Greg LeMond on the Champs-Élysées. The NBC was getting involved. Was it becoming like much more world recognised and more interest from, especially a country like the USA?
Yeah, I mean, Greg LeMond kind of opened. I mean, there had been English-speaking, cycling stars in the past. I think in Tom Simpson that brings us back to doping, unfortunately. But Greg LeMond kind of opened. Yeah, I mean, NBC went into big American networks started coming to the Tour de France. There was rumors at the time that a big Hollywood movie would be made, from the Tour and on the Tour. But they quickly found out that the Tour de France, drama was actually much better in real life than what a Hollywood movie could have done. So yeah, there was a real opening. There was also, bear in mind that in 1989 was the end of the Berlin Wall, and Russian riders started to come to Italy to ride. So you had guys from the Eastern Bloc who were amateurs and up till then that started coming into the professional ranks. Yeah, so actually the 1989 Tour de France, which as you said was won by the slimmest margin by Greg LeMond, so it was a dramatic story because he was back in action after a hunting accident nearly ruined his career and his life. The American beating the Frenchman, on the Champs-Élysées by 8 seconds marks maybe the end of an era. Like the world was the world was beating France, and no Frenchman, as we said, ever came that close to winning the Tour de France again since. So obviously Greg was a guy who really played a major role in the globalization of cycling and of the Tour de France, for sure. But that period was also the one when, from 1989, 1990, we started to hear about a new drug, erythropoietin. Nobody knew what it was, and of course it's EPO. And there were already in 1989, 1990 we saw guys like Steven Rooks, Gatien Tunisa, who were Dutch riders who had been kind of classic type riders, one day race type of riders, and all of a sudden they were flying up the mountain. So they started to have kind of a doubt, and Jean-Marie Leblanc was one of the first one to, I remember, he wrote a column in L'Équipe. He was still director of the Tour de France, but he still wrote a column in L'Équipe saying new drugs are circulating and they're changing the very nature of the sport because, riders who are not very good or who are not pure climbers all of a sudden become exceptional. So there was awareness that something was going on.
Were they trying to change the race format to sort of, go against this way of the doping, or shorten stages, or I don't know how they could have gone about it, but what was happening behind the scenes when it came to the Tour de France to sort of attack this? Yeah,
so there were concerns about doping. They were aware that it was getting out of hand, and so there were lots of campaigns to have shorter stages, to have more rest days, because the idea that was spread at the time is that cycling is too hard and the Tour de France is too long stages, maybe too many mountains, and so since that period, there's been a tendency to have shorter stages, and we've reached a stage now, when actually the type of stages that are favored by organizers in the mountain is to have shorter stages because they're more eventful. Also, unfortunately for the sprinters and the big guys like you or Mitch, there's also the time cut issue that makes it more difficult for sprinters or for the gruppetto to get to the finish on time. So it's more exciting. More things happen, and probably it doesn't eat up as much energy in the riders, because at the time with EPO we always mention the winners, the guys who took doping to win, but actually most of the peloton, most of the guys who were taking stuff back in the 1980s or 1990s was just to survive. And to still do their job. So we always see
doping from the side of the cheaters of Lance Armstrong, or guys who might have won the Tour. Bjarne Riis, the guy who confessed, having taken stuff to win. But most of the guys actually were doing it was just to keep their job, and that's when it went really bad, because in a way everybody had an interest in doping. So for the organizers, the question was, how can we, from our point of view, not only crack down on drugs, but offer a terrain where doping would be less necessary than it was at the time.
Well, the 90s were dominated by Miguel Indurain, who was the only guy to win it 5 times in a row, the Tour de France. But I think he started this sort of transition where the focus on time trialling as a GC man sort of started, and since then we've seen all GC men become these ultimate time trialers. I'm not saying before they weren't, but I feel like Miguel Indurain, that was something that he really harnessed and started, and he was an absolute killer in the time trial. I think then started to shift the focus when you're talking about the racing. I don't know, do you think this is why they've maybe included some big time trials now, and team time trialing became a discipline that people are interested in?
Yeah, there's been ups and downs in the relationship of the UCI and of tour organizers, Grand Tour organizers towards time trial. That there's a kind of a shift in the other direction now, because Christian Prudhomme, for one, doesn't like time trial that much, and so in this tour, the 2023 tour, there's only one time trial, and it's pretty short. In those days, you had long time trials. I remember like 50Ks was often the rule for time trials. Maybe Armstrong was a good time trialist as well. Gave the idea to the organizer that he was. The problem with time trials is that they give such an advantage to the strong guy that they almost make the battle in the mountains irrelevant, because when someone took a minute and a half or 2 minutes or 2 minutes 30 in a time trial, it was very, very difficult to take them back in the mountains. Well, I think what Indurain brought more importantly in the tactics around the Tour de France was that he was a guy who was really preparing almost exclusively for the Tour, a little bit for the Vuelta as well, because he was, in the wake of the Tour, in the aftermath, on his Tour de France form, he could go on and perform in the Vuelta, which he didn't win actually, but he was, he finished top 3. But the thing was, Indurain, I think, was the first guy to really, he rode very few classics. He didn't ride, lots of. He could have won like Classica San Sebastian, and I think he did. But or Liège, Bastogne, Liège, or the sort of. I mean, it was ideally, but he didn't. The Tour de France was his one and only goal, and he was prepared for that. And that's what happened next. Armstrong and all these guys, they were all going for the thing was, preparing with races like Le Dauphiné, Paris-Nice, or the Tour de Suisse. But it was the only goal was the Tour, which was new, because before that, Merckx, Coppi, Hinault, they were going for everything. They were riding the Giro, they were riding the Vuelta, they were winning classics, which Indurain was not doing. So that's something new he introduced, and also introduced what you could call you have the sprinters train, and he introduced the GC train. The fact that in the mountains you had all this Banesto team, you had 4 or 5 guys leading the way up the mountains and setting a pace that was so hard that nobody else could follow. I think the Banesto team were the first to introduce that way of riding, or at least to make it systematic. In the mountains, the thing was high pace, nobody can attack, and there we go. And obviously it was taken back by US Postal and then by Team Sky. That sort of tactics was kind of introduced by Indurain and Banesto.
Yeah, it's amazing. I didn't actually know that about Banesto. That was the sort of the way they paved the way, and obviously things as technology and tactics got more attuned. We've seen that right up until Team Sky after the US Postal it became much more in tune. We're seeing it today with Jumbo-Visma. Maybe it's not as organised as that, where they're just purely riding the front on climbs. They're introducing now, because of these new stages, I guess, a lot more different tactics, sending guys in breaks, and then catching up and then using guys later on in the race. So it's still morphing this idea of using your team today.
Yeah, I think cycling has become more of a team sport. We always say, it's an individual sport, that's been raced, in teams. But cycling effectively really became a team sport in the 1990s, I believe. In the past, they were picking the best guys, and let's see what happens. They were not like, you had domestiques, of course, but the role was more to protect from the wind, in the echelons and go for the bottles. But then in the mountains, the big guys were left to their own devices. They were much less, there were fewer lead-out guys. There were all even in sprints, the way they were organized. Sprinters like Rick van Steenbergen or the Rick van Looy or the 1951s or André Darrigade, they didn't have a lead-out guy. They went for it, by themselves. So gradually in all those years, the strategy, the tactics, and the race techniques we find, like Sprinters train was really developed and by
Mario Cipollini.
I was looking, and the Psycho team. That's when they really started doing that in a systematic fashion, and that's when sprinters started to really depend on their train, whereas in the past there were several ways to do that. So this strategy of sprinters train, the lead-out trains, GC trains, all came to the fore.
Tell me about what was going on with the UCI and the ASO at this point, because the UCI in the 90s there and early 2000s, they created also like a World Cup series and didn't really get into the Tour de France. The ASO, what was going on between this sort of battle, or I guess war almost, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that as far as the organization of cycling is concerned, the 1990s and noughties were absolutely essential to what we know now, and namely the World Tour and the monuments and all that. It took a lot of time for organizers and the UCI to found an agreement to organize the calendar. In the 1980s, Hein Verbruggen, who was the head of the UCI, tried to impose a new system, and they also were okay with that, kind of a World Cup system like Formula One. Like, you had points, you scored points in each of the classics, and they tried to have classics in some of those World Cup races in every country. There was one in Britain, one in Germany. They really tried to have to emulate Formula One. At first they so agreed, and then after a while they decided with it was against their best interests to have a series that they didn't run, because the reason why the UCI wanted this World Cup series was to own the series and to own the TV rights, like Bernie Ecclestone in Formula One, it was owning the rights. So there was a real war between Verbruggen, the UCI, and ASO over TV rights, and that's when the struggle started. That ASO main asset was the Tour de France. They own the biggest tour in the world, and whatever.
They didn't need the UCI, really, did they?
They didn't need it. And what they did was to hamper the UCI plans. They had already organized Paris-Roubaix, but they started buying other races. Paris-Nice were struggling. It was run by another company, another family from the Yamori group, was the Lelio. They bought Paris-Nice. They bought the Dauphiné Libéré after a while, Critérium du Dauphiné, that belonged to another newspaper group, the Dauphiné, of course. And they started to buy and organize some of the Belgian races, like Liège, and then they also took shares in the Vuelta. So they decided to spread, to make it impossible for the UCI to create a kind of rival circuit. And there came a moment when actually the ASO was actually ruling the sport. So it's a sport that was kind of privately owned, a little bit like the NBA have their own rules and their own their own basketball, even if you got FIBA, which is the international federation, and the rules are slightly different. But now, let's face it, the NBA effectively even rules the rest of amateur basketball and the NCAA and everything. So there's the same with ASO. So the problem, and also there was a problem. We mentioned doping. Doping was also another issue, because the UCI, of course, was trying to crack down on doping, but the problem at the time with many sports is that federations was both judges and parties to in doping, because they were the UCI was the body that was supposed to be cracking down on doping, but at the same time, the simple fact of acknowledging that you have doping in your sport is hampering your sport. The best example of that was Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong for the UCI for Hein Verbruggen was, a blessing. He had everything you needed: star status, cancer survivor, winning the Tour de France 7 times in a row, and his voice was heard throughout the planet. Lance Armstrong made cycling 10 times more popular than it ever was before. So of course he cheated, of course he was a doper, and of course at some stage the UCI were probably aware of it. But it was bringing so much popularity to the sport that the UCI were in two minds. What do? We have these guys. It was the best promotion we ever had for our sport. If we reveal his doping actions and misbehavings, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So part of the Armstrong problem was that, and ASO saw in Armstrong kind of a weak spot they could use in their battle against the UCI, and they were against Armstrong from day one. I mean, Jean-Marie Leblanc couldn't stand Armstrong, and then when he was replaced by Christian Prudhomme, it was even worse. Christian Prudhomme took over from Jean-Marie Leblanc, which was an interesting shift because Jean-Marie Leblanc was the last, written press journalist to.
He's been a race director?
Yeah, had been the race director. Christian Prudhomme came from TV, so you could see the change in the media influence on the race. And when Christian Prudhomme took over, he kept repeating, I'm going to crack down, the UCI are not doing their job, we're going to crack down on doping, and we're going to take doping out of the sport. He had to do that because of the Festina scandal. 1998, of course, I mean, the leading team of the time, that the Festina team led by Frenchman Richard Virenque, they were kicked out of the race because drugs were found in a team car, and then there were police raids, and that's when the police started to get into it. Doping became an offense, and police in France in Italy started raiding team hotels, and that's when everything changed. So Prudhomme said when he arrived, I'm going to I'm going to make sure there's no more doping in sport, and
made big statements.
Yeah, make big statements. And he said, to do that, I have to kick out a few people from the sport. And he named Verbruggen, and he named then Pat McQuaid, who took over from Verbruggen at the head of UCI, as the guys he wanted out of the sport. And also Manolo Saiz, I mean, the guy who was involved later in 2006 in the Puerto case, who was the team manager of Spanish team Once. So there was this strong stance, we're ASO private race organizers, we're going to clamp down on doping because the UCI are not doing their job. And actually how did it end? Well, in a draw in a way, because that's when Mario Di Lamori, the owner of the Tour de France, came into the game. And at the Beijing Olympics, so that's 2008, only 2 years after Christian Prudhomme is slowly introduced as the new Tour de France director, that she summoned a meeting between Pat McQuaid, the UCI president, and Christian Prudhomme, and said, now you're going to settle your row, because all this talk about doping and scandals and is harming the sport, is not doing, and it's harming the Tour de France. And I own the Tour de France, that's my business, and I don't want it to be ruined by doping allegation, doping stories, doping scandal all the time. So she said, the UCI, clean your game. We want doping out of the sport. And she told Christian Prudhomme, now stop talking about doping. That's not your job. Your job is to promote the Tour de France. And I think that's the situation we're out now. I mean, the current UCI president is a Frenchman, David Lapartien, and he's often been seen and described as ASO candidate. So. We're back to a situation where ASO and UCI work kind of hand in hand and are almost one and the same thing, which is actually going back full circle, because this UCI was created by who? By Henri Desgranges, who is the founder of Tour de France. So, in a way, those two entities that for a long time seemed rival from the start, almost, being one and the same thing.
Let's just talk about now, lastly, where the race is at today, and a big transition through that period, like you said, the Lance Armstrong period, of course, and then in the late sort of 2007, just before 2010, we saw a real transition of the race. That's when I was sort of professional and I came into it, and a lot of people told me that you're coming into a new world of, we're talking about cycling as a whole here, not just the Tour de France. But I think that's when we saw, the emergence of different styles of winners, and a guy, Cadel Evans, who raced through a lot of that dark period and was viewed as a rider who was a bit strange, doing things a bit differently. But I think we've found out now that was because he was clean. He was doing it his own way, and I think for me he is a pinnacle rider to sort of show the new direction that the race went in, the Tour de France, and we saw these new winners.
Yeah, I think that after the Festina scandal, there was a serious scandal that affected, country by country. You had so France were affected by the Festina scandal. It took them 10 years to rebuild, to find a new generation of riders. Then you had the Puerto scandal, and Spain, had to reinvent itself in cycling. Then Biarritz confessed of doping, and then Denmark also had to, find a new generation. And we had the telecom scandal, and then Germany kind of went out of cycling with with Jan Ullrich and Eric Zabel and all these guys, and also had to reinvent itself. And so gradually every country had their own doping scandal, which helped them find a new way of doing their sport. Then of course with the Team Sky phenomenon, when actually the Brits were very clever in that sense, identified kind of a sport with lots of weaknesses where you could go into and probably win the Tour de France within 5 years. When I first heard it was in the Tour de France press room, the Team Sky project, Brailsford's project of winning the Tour de France in 5 years, I told myself, well, those Brits, they're really arrogant. Well, who do they think they are? But they did it, they did it. And how did they did it? Well, the way the sport has evolved, I already mentioned the tactics, the team strategy and everything, but also marginal gains might have been kind of a legend, but there's a little bit of truth in there, in which, compared to Louison Bobet, for instance, or even if he was a guy who had a personal doctor and was training in what he thought were the scientific fashion of the time.
Back then.
But all today, your diet, everything, the aerodynamics, the bikes, power meters, all the equipment, computers and programs, everything's improved dramatically. The bikes you're using now, bike guys, nothing at all. You can't compare them at all with the bikes Eddie Merckx was riding on. Everything's better.
Well, the data too. Everything's got data around it. I think, and that it's accessible and it's able to be questioned. I think by anyone. I get the feeling that back in the day was you wouldn't question about a bike maker about the bike he's made, but now everyone's questioning everything because they've got access to the data about power, about the aerodynamics, about the nutrition. Young guys now can research whatever they want on the internet and be as smart as their director sportives in a way.
That's right, and that's why we see younger riders coming up and winning the Tour at 21, and a lot of DSs I've talked to about that. They say, well, that in back in the day when they started to coach a 16-year-old, 17-year-old rider, they didn't know anything. They didn't know anything about riding in the bunch. They had no technique, no nothing. These days, they tell me they've got 16-year-old kids who can ride in a bunch, very technically gifted, also because they come from mountain bike, they come from cyclocross, they come from BMX, they come from different kind of cycling. Well, for other forms of cycling, and they're kind of fully formed at 17. They've got the best equipment. I'm amazed myself when I go sometimes up a mountain to watch a race, and you see the young kids riding up.
they've got it all the gear.
They look like mini pros, don't they?
They got like mini pros. I mean, very lean, and you can tell that these guys probably have protocols and a diet and stuff. So that's a big difference from the old days.
Is that something though that you like to see, or is it something that sort of saddens you? That I don't know. For me, I wouldn't say saddens, probably a bit harsh, but it's like. It seems so intense for young guys now. They're sort of taking that sort of the love away from it in a way. But maybe not. Maybe that's what they love, the data.
Yeah, it's less romantic probably, but in the same time, at the level of racing as improved. We have a generation like with Tadej Pogacar, Jonas Vingegaard, Wout van Aert, Mathieu van der Poel, Remco Evenepoel. I can't remember that such a dance quality in a world peloton as this. It's never been that good. So it means exciting riding. It means the guys are clever. They are personalities. They're likable, which was not always the case in the past. So we have a tendency to romanticize the past, but in terms of the intensity and the excitement of the competition, it's never been better. This said, the pressure these guys put on themselves from a young age is so hard that there are types of riders they can't adjust to this. I'm thinking Marcel Kittel or Tom Dumoulin, who gave up their career when they were actually almost at the top. I mean, these two guys were some of the most fantastic athletes we've seen in the past, and they just couldn't handle the life as a professional and the constant pressure and stress it involved. And it came to me when Tom Dumoulin announced he was giving up for good, that he and Marcel Kittel was probably the nicest guys I'd known in cycling. But I'm afraid cycling is not for nice guys. It's a tough guys sport.
Where's the future of the Tour de France going, in your opinion? This is your last Tour de France as a journalist. I know you've got a lot of interest in the race and you've got your ear to the ground. What have you heard? What do they want to do with the race, and what do you predict they're going to do with the race with all this sort of stuff we've spoken about, where athletes are going, cyclists? Where do you predict the race will go from here? That's a general question, I know.
Yeah, I don't think it'll change because dramatically, because in spite of everything we said and the evolution and the improvements and everything, deep down it's the same race. 80% of it is still the same. The kind of circus going around France, the fans, the excitement, the publicity caravan, the pressure that the riders feel and the impression they have to be in a larger-than-life sports event, which is second to none. This is not going to change, and I know that the organizers are just looking for. There's an approach that because we discuss sports and business a lot, but there's the heritage aspect of the tour that's important, and the organizers and Christian Prudhomme and Thierry Gouvenou, who is his right hand, they're very aware that also there's a whole category of people who watch the tour who are not into cycling that much, who are there to watch the Mont Saint-Michel, the Eiffel Tower, or all these monuments, and that's part of the Tour de France. And so we're going this year back to Puy de Dôme, and it's also one of the things that Christian Prudhomme wanted to do, go back to the iconic places where the Tour history took place. And so I think they're looking for a mixture of nostalgia and futuristic. Like we're also going to Col de la Loze, in the Alps, which is actually a mountain pass that's been created especially for riders. And at first it was used by mountain bikers. So they're trying to find the right mix between the history, the past, and the nostalgia, and a kind of a modernist approach to the sport. And the thing I'm really glad about as I'm about to retire is that like 15 after the Festina scandal and like 15 years ago, you had the impression that cycling was an old man sport. I mean, the interest in France and in Europe was more like over 50 plus, sometimes 60 plus fans, mostly males, and that's changed totally.
Completely, yeah.
And that's great. And of course, the real future of the race is the girls. The women's tour started last year. It was a huge success from day one, and the time was ripe for it, and the time is riper than ever. And hopefully, I'm not saying we're going to have a 3 weeks women's tour soon, but we're gradually coming to that, and it'll be another exciting moment.
Francois, thank you for your wealth of knowledge on the race. I've been enjoying just sitting here listening to it, so thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, there was a lot there, guys, but I hope you enjoyed it. Francois, like I said to you, he is a great voice to listen to and such a wealth of knowledge. I really couldn't get any words in there, or nor did I need to. Thank you, Francois. I'm going to miss seeing you over here at the Tour de France. He is retired from the Tour de France this year, but you never know. I'm sure he'll be back, and as you can hear, he does really love the race. Big thanks to Will Jones, who puts these episodes together, the Life in the Peloton team, Meg and Spurlow behind the scenes. And guys, next week I've got a great episode for you. It's a Talking Luft. It is the history of the Tour de France, Talking Luft. While I was out there in the buses, I quizzed a few riders to hear how much they actually knew about the big race that they were in. So guys, until next week, and thanks to our big partner Rapha in the podcast. So guys, until then, cheers. The music in this episode was composed by Pete Shelley. Cheers, mate.